Thank you, Carrie, and it is fabulous to be here. I'm very excited about this session. We can go to the next slide and I'll do a few introductions. My name is David Feehan. I'm an EVP here at CynergisTek. I'm also a recovering CIO, healthcare CIO, as well as privacy and security officer. And I have with me today one of the people who is absolutely among my favorite people in the world to talk to. And I started preparing an introduction, and I'm at a very sensitive age where a long intro sounds like an obituary. So Marti is not at that age, but I'm going to let Marti Arvin introduce herself, and then we'll dive in.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon or morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Marti Arvin. I'm an executive advisor with CynergisTek. And I, like David, am a recovering compliance officer, privacy officer, attorney, and a few other things that I'm not going to get into, because that'll give you that history that David was just referencing. But I look forward to speaking with you this afternoon and want to make sure that you join us and really make this a collaborative session when we get into the second half of the discussion. So thank you. David, next slide.
We can go to the next slide and talk about some learning objectives here today. But before we dive into the learning objectives, I want to mention that we're going to talk about a lot of topics today, and some of them are alone, and you can address them separately. But at some point when you're looking at a cyber incident, everything has to come together, and we're certainly going to talk about that as well. But at some point, dealing with a cyber incident or any incident, frankly, it all comes down to balancing priorities. And I just want to call out a few things around balancing priorities. You can't balance priorities if you don't have any. And so often developing an incident response plan, dealing with an incident, is understanding what your priorities are. An example of that is I was the CIO at a hospital that had an absolute shelter-in-place approach to incidents, whether it was a hurricane or a cyber incident. And so everything we built was around shelter in place, whereas neighboring hospitals took a different approach. They wanted to be able to evacuate or move to sister hospitals or move to their own hospitals within that system. But if you don't have those priorities set up front, all these other things we're going to talk about become more difficult. And two other things, if you don't have priorities, nothing will get done. So you have to have the priorities defined. You have to know what an incident is. You have to know how to initiate an incident, because if you haven't done that, you can't start walking through the priorities. Now, the other thing is you can have too many priorities. And if you have too many priorities, nothing gets done as well. And the last piece, because everyone has a functional part in an incident response, is everyone's priorities cannot be the organization's priorities. So it takes executive leadership looking at all the pieces and pulling it together. And now into the learning objectives. These are some of the things we're going to look at today. First, we're going to look at some industry information, and I can tell you that our annual report was released today. We'll look at some of the initial data relating to response and recovery under the NIST CSF. And then we're going to look at some of the IR plan details. That really is most of our discussion, these last three learning objectives, but knowing what you should include in the response plan and the preparation for the response plan. And at this point, I'm going to let Marti talk about these last two objectives.
Marti, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I tried to be gracious to mute myself during David and forgot to unmute. I was just saying that one of the things that I think you really want to focus on is a communication plan, and think about that in broad context. And that's what we're going to talk through today and as part of the presentation. And it's not just communicating internally, but externally as well. So we'll go into some of the details around what you might want to think about around that. And then also to make sure that this is broadened out to encompass not just the information technology team, but privacy and compliance, and we'll talk more even senior leadership and other stakeholders in the organization. So that's where we're prioritizing some of the learning objectives for this particular session. Next session, and David, I'll turn it back to you to start going through some of the industry data. Next slide. Oh, I apologize. I forgot we were doing a polling question before that. So polling question number 1. And as a reminder, to complete the poll, click on the poll icon in the left-hand side of your screen. You should see poll question 1 there and an option to vote now. If you click vote now, it will give you the responses, and please respond to that, and we'll look at those results in a moment. But the question is, based on assessments using the NIST-CF standards, what is the biggest weakness in healthcare incident response planning? And so we have 4 options. Obviously, there could be a few more, but for the purposes of this poll, we have 4 options for you to select. And you'll see those again under that poll tab.
And as I mentioned, our annual report is out, and so we're going to be using data from that annual report, which is available to you, and we'll give you information later on how to find that. But so we can cheat because we have some of that data already in our hands. But it'll be interesting to see where you think you are having issues or believe the industry is having issues.
Yeah, we've got about half people who've responded to this, so we're going to give it just another moment or two before we talk about the results. So David, it looks like what we're seeing is the vast number of, or the highest number of people, I should say, are saying training and exercising of employees is one of the biggest weaknesses. Second, next to that is training and exercising at the enterprise level. And that's something I know you and I talked a lot about. That's now tied, though, with lack of the communication plan. And it was not my intent to tee this up by my comment on the communication plan in the previous slide, just FYI. But up-to-date plans, that's interesting to me that really has the lowest number of responses. About 15.5% of people say that up-to-date plans, they think, is one of the biggest weaknesses. The highest number still stays with exercising with employees. Lack of a communication plan has now jumped ahead of lack of training at the enterprise level. So we have about 2/3 of our attendees who have responded. So David, do you want to make any additional comments or move on to the data?
Absolutely. I'll dive in here with the data. And if you've got your NIST CSF manual in front of you, I'm going to really talk to the lowest subcategory score we saw in this area, which is response RS.RP-1, which is really response planning is executed during or after an incident. And this was one of the lowest scoring areas. Having a response plan allows you to proactively intervene and prevent or reduce issues that occur in the event of a cyber incident. And an incident response plan is something that every organization should have in place. But it only works if you execute on it, if you call it into action and initiate it. And most organizations, based on our assessments over the course of the year 2020, most organizations didn't initiate the response plan even when they had a cyber incident. So it speaks really to the exercising of employees in a response plan, as well as having an up-to-date plan. And that leads me to my own ruminations on this. And they are twofold. You can underreact to a cyber attack, and that's what we see typically. People respond too late, whereas if they had pulled the trigger a little sooner, they may have had a better response. And I'm going to say number 2, and because I'm at a security firm, I will deny saying it, even though this is being recorded. You can also overreact to an incident. And you know, some examples of this, I remember as a consultant, I got called in on the day before Christmas Eve. The hospital was half staffed, and the CTO called me. The CEO had alerted me. I knew the CIO for many years. Got the call from the CTO, and I said, you need to drop your internet connectivity. And there was a long pause. Their NAS, their online storage, was literally being eaten as we were talking, and there was a pause, and he finally said to me, he said, I can't drop connectivity. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because we have a huge number of remote nurses, and they need to get to the NAS in order to treat patients in the field. That was a good call. I had overreacted. I didn't, of course, know the implications of shutting down internet connectivity, and I learned from that. On the other hand, about 3 weeks ago, I got a call from a CIO whose CISO was telling him to change every password in Active Directory, around 24,000 people, many of them physicians from 2 separate teaching hospitals. And he was ready to do that if it was the right thing. They didn't have enough information about the attack on their AD, and I advised him to wait until the CISO could produce some more evidence. He was very glad, because most of you on this call know that the only thing worse than telling a doctor to have a password is making them change the password they have. So you can, like I said, you can overreact, and you want to be careful about that, but conversely, you can underreact too, and you need to be very careful about that. And we can go to the next slide and look at the response. This is from, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. We need to go back one to respond. And this is from our annual report, and these are the top issues we found: incomplete or missing playbooks. Oddly enough, an over-reliance on cyber insurance. People thought that the cyber insurance underwriter was going to deal with their incident, and that is not true. We're going to talk a little bit about cyber insurance later, and we hope you will bring that issue up. Cyber insurance has to be part of your strategy, but it really is not a protection against the talk. And the other thing we see is no one can really go this alone, whether it's the breach notification that falls out of an attack, or just notifying all your employees and setting up alternative communication channels. You're going to have outside help. And if you don't have those contracts lined up, it may be too late. In the next slide, when we move into the recover area of NIST CSF, one of the things we see, sadly, is not all systems get built into recovery planning. And this will come up, but when you do a business impact analysis, you have to look at everything. When I started my first business impact analysis as a CIO, and there was a long story getting there, but I noticed as we started working through the systems, this was a shelter-in-place strategy that we were working towards. No one had the dietary or kitchen systems on their list, which meant that we might have been able to survive the attack and been up and running, and none of our patients in beds would have gotten meals they'd asked for. So we went back and revisited, but make sure you have everything you need in your planning up front. And then the lack of an understanding, if you can even recover in the event of a large-scale event. You may have to shut down, you may have to move patients, you may have to do other things if you're not prepared, and it's better to know that up front. And these are the subcategories you see, and these are the dark blue is the high-performing organizations that scored more than 80% in this CSF conformance. And not great scores, but at least above a 3, which we consider minimal. And the low-performing organizations, which is still most of healthcare, under 80% conformance with the NIST CSF, not even to a 3. So a word to the wise for everyone. It's time to get to work. I have one event that really kind of changed my whole attitude towards towards preparation and what incident response really was about. I was the CIO at the pediatric hospital in Houston, Texas, when Katrina hit New Orleans, and we were charged with evacuating all the pediatric patients out of New Orleans. And they didn't all come to us, but we were responsible for coordinating their dispatch to other hospitals across the country. And I had medical records under IT at that point. I was getting a lot of heat from physicians who were getting these weeks old or months old patients. They were not evacuating parents or caregivers. They were literally taking kids with a medic who could take them, keep them healthy enough in the helicopter flight. But there were no charts. So these tiny infants would arrive, and doctors knew they were very sick because they were in an ICU or in a hospital at that age, but they had no idea what was wrong with them. And I went to our CEO, who was running our command center and had the direct connection to New Orleans, and I said, we've got to ask them about getting charts, or at least key information out of the charts, so when these patients arrive, we know what we need to do with them. And he looked at me, he said, they are in a crisis. We cannot ask them what to do. They don't know what to do. We need to tell them what to do. And so we told them how we were going to handle records and got that worked out. But when I went back to my office that day, I realized the crisis is not the time to figure out what you need to do. You need to have the plan in place so you don't have to think when the bad thing happens. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Marty, which speaks to response plans.
Thanks, David. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? So when you think about this is something I think many of you on the call are probably familiar with, the structure of it. But one of the things I want to point out is, we talk about an enterprise plan. And as I've worked with clients, I think that's one of the things I've seen when you talk about incident response, talking about the idea that it's not just the technical team or the IT team that's doing that tabletop exercise or that immersive exercise, but it's really something that you do, at least maybe not everyone, but as part of your routine process. Some of those incident response exercises are an enterprise incident response. And I think that's important because if your IT team knows how to stop the promulgation of the ransomware or to shut off the EHR, that's great. But what do those clinicians need to know how to do once that occurs? What's going to happen with the documentation? What's going to happen with the patient care? So that's why we encourage doing enterprise incident response plans with some regularity. Again, it may not be every time, but that should be a regular part of your practice. And so that's also practicing the different threat scenarios, because how you respond to a ransomware incident may be very different to how you respond to an email phishing incident that's just trying to direct people to a malicious website and making sure people don't fall for that. And if they have, what do you do in response to that? So I think it's really thinking through what are the scenarios and what could be involved here to make sure that you've thought through how you might respond differently based on the different scenario. And, how do you determine that incident severity? A lot of organizations have some sort of tiered approach to this where they've talked about first, something's an event. In other words, we know there's an anomaly. We know there's something that's not right. We don't know yet what it is or what's happening. And then they may know, well, this has impacted our system in some way. So that might escalate from an event to an incident. And then at some point in time, if you determine that bad actors are in your system or bad actors have acquired your data or bad actors have, gotten people to click on malicious sites through a phishing attempt, then you're going to know now it's potentially a breach. And one of the things I'm a firm advocate of, and I say it over and over, is definition discipline. I don't care what definitions you use for each of those or how you categorize it, with the exception of breach, because breach is a regulatorily defined term. So I think it's very important that you exercise that definition discipline, and you only use the B word when somebody who has the authority to say, yes, it is a breach, has made that conclusion. And then, of course, you want to contain the incident and make sure that you've talked through how you're going to contain it rapidly, and then what you may be doing to continue to contain it on an ongoing basis. And then again, removing that ransomware from your system, or that malware from your system, removing that bad actor from your system, whatever you need to do. And then finally, recover. And that's really getting you back to business as usual. And I think one of the things I also see is that people don't always recognize this might take months. Anybody who's had a significant cyber incident knows this. But if you haven't gone through that experience yet, trust me, it is going to take months to fully recover. And David and I think, are going to harp on this throughout this presentation. Exercise, exercise, exercise. Because the more you exercise, the more you will be prepared. And also, every time you exercise, you're going to find something you hadn't previously thought about. And so you might have a great plan in place and things go pretty well. But as you exercise it the next time, you're going to maybe have a different player in the room, somebody participating that wasn't participating, and last time, and they're going to have a different thought process. They're going to have a different lens they're going to be looking at it through, and you're going to see something else that you can be better prepared for. As I've also said a lot of times in doing incident response exercises, it's going to be chaos. There's no way to avoid it from being chaos. But the more you exercise the plan, the more prepared you are, the more people know what to expect of them, you can help diminish that chaos. And that's like David's comments about having those contracts in place with that forensic IT firm, having those contracts in place with that breach response support company already, because you don't need to be doing those contracts in the middle of the chaos. So as you think through this, again, you learn and adjust and continue your process. David, do you want to add any comments before we move to the next poll question?
Yeah, I would. I think this is a great overview, Marty, and you did a great job explaining it. So I would say preparation is the most important step, because if you don't start, you can't ever get through the crisis. But people often ask me what the most dangerous phase or the most difficult phase of a IR response is. And my answer to that is the most dangerous part of a crisis is the aftermath, because it's over. That's when everyone wants to take a deep sigh and go back to work or go sleep. And that's when you have all that learning fresh in your mind. And if you don't capture it, it will be lost in that next iteration, because the bad thing's going to happen again, I'm sorry to say. And the more you learn, the more knowledge you can build into that preparation, the easier the next one's going to be.
Thank you. Next slide. So now our next polling question, and again, as a reminder, click on that poll icon on the left-hand side of your screen, select vote now for poll question number 2, and please enter your responses. And so what are the most common mistakes organizations make when it comes to responding to an incident? Well, I think David just named a couple of them, and so please add your appropriate responses in the poll question, again for poll question number 2.
Yeah, I have a favorite on common mistakes, Marty, and it's, the thing you plan for is never the thing that happens. It's easy. It's kind of like the way we test software in this country. We test around the way things are supposed to work. So we don't find flaws until we push it out, and real users do things we never anticipated and didn't design for. And incidents, cybersecurity incidents, happen the same way. We do scenarios that we expect or anticipate, and one of the flukiest responses I saw was they had the data center had a console, and they had just redone power distribution and put in a backup console, so if one console failed, it would fail over, and sure enough, everything was working, had been tested, and then there was a power failure and the time limit exceeded, and one of the consoles shut down. and it switched over to the backup console, and everything was humming along fine for about a minute and a half. And then the second console shut down. Well, we did the post-incident review, and we found out that when they did all this rehab work, all this electrical work, and put in the backup console, they changed the batteries in both the primary and the secondary console on the same day with batteries from the same batch. So they had very close to the same life and failed together. Not a scenario we would typically think about, but it got built into our planning and processes that when you had situations like that, you didn't put backups tied to the same battery at the same time frame. So an interesting adjustment we made during the course of our life there.
Well, and I think another thing to think about is if you're creating your own incident response exercise, you kind of know what to expect and anticipate. And so that might be an argument and justification for bringing an external party in. You know, obviously we do this type of service, but, you know, I think having that lens of somebody and that direction of somebody who knows what the scenario, how it's going to play out, but having people that are actually immersed in it who have to do this if an actual incident occurs, not know what the scenario is going to play out is exactly part of what you're talking about, David. If you don't know what to expect in your incident response and somebody throws something at you, how are you going to adjust? And I'll tell a quick story about one of our colleagues shared an incident response exercise that he did. He was the CISO at the organization, and they prepared for the exercise, and he told everybody ahead of time they were going to be doing it on Tuesday. And he started on, I think he said Sunday night, calling the help desk and putting in fake tickets for something that would arguably be an alert that this incident might occur. The incident occurs on Tuesday. They trigger the incident response plan. And about an hour into the incident of everybody gathered in the conference room, somebody called him and said, "Hey, are you going to join us or not?" And he said, "Well, nobody called me." And they said, "Well, what do you mean? You knew we were doing this exercise." He said, "No, part of the incident response is you need to alert the CISO that the incident's occurring, and nobody's called me to tell me." And I think it was refreshing to hear it because it was one of those things where it's like, well, he knows it's happening. He knows he's supposed to be here. But the whole point of it was nobody had followed the plan and alerted him.
Well, our audience, Marty, must have heard your story because we have an even split in not including everyone who needs to be involved and not developing or rehearsing a cyber event. And that is, I certainly see that. Healthcare is great at planning for airplane crashes and terrorist attacks and chemical spills, but we don't see often enough the cyber event, which is more likely to happen.
Yeah, and before we move on to our next poll question, I just want to make a comment about not developing or rehearsing for a cyber event is 37% of the responses. But interestingly enough, the lowest response is not keeping the plan updated, which I find a bit of a conflict because how can you update the plan if you don't exercise it to know what the issues are that you need to update the plan for? And so it's, those two to me kind of go a bit hand in hand. In order to keep your plan updated, you have to be constantly exercising and preparing for the new threats that come along. And so I think those two would more go hand in hand than what our poll results find. Yeah. Do we want to move on to the next poll, David?
Absolutely.
Next slide. So this is a topic we've talked a lot about. And again, go to the poll tab and please submit your responses for poll question number 3. But when do you execute your communication plan? And so we're going to have folks respond to that and tell us what they think. Is it just when an incident's occurred? Is it when there is actually somebody designated as a crisis? Or could it be both? And I mentioned this earlier that a communication plan, I can't tell you how critical that's been in the incidents I've been involved with. And it's also, you need to ensure that you think about this broadly. So your communication plan is not just how do you respond to media inquiries, but you need to think through how do you prepare your press release that you're going to control the release of? How do you prepare for responses when the media somehow gets wind of this and they start calling your people? How do you communicate internally to your staff in both of those same scenarios? What's your controlled communication response? And what do you have as a placeholder if somebody starts questioning this, and invariably your grapevine starts being utilized? And I think that's really important. When you think about your external communication plan, you need to be thinking about not only the media, but how do we communicate with regulators? How do we communicate with affiliated parties and entities? If you are a system that uses Epic and you have Community Connect and you have to shut down the EHR, that means you're going to be shutting down the EHR for all those connected parties as well. So what's your process for alerting them? What's your process for alerting patients? Again, if you shut down the EHR, your patient portal is likely going to go down. So what are you going to do to help patients understand this? Are you going to have a banner prepared that says temporarily unavailable? And so those are the kinds of things. Think broadly about all the parties that you need to communicate with. And then two other things I think are very important is designate your spokesperson and make sure everybody knows that David's the spokesperson. If you get a request from media, if you get a request from a regulator, that needs to go to David. Or you might have different people for different parties. So maybe your media relation person would be the respondent for media requests, but maybe your CISO, your compliance officer, your privacy officer, or your CEO would be the respondent if a regulator makes an inquiry. But make sure everybody knows who that is. And then finally, your message doesn't have to be exactly the same, but it does have to be consistent. And you can't have one person telling the media one thing and another person telling the media something different. I actually worked at an organization where we had a significant crisis and we didn't have that kind of control in place. And that is literally what happened. The media would call one party and ask a question and they got an answer. And they would call a different party and they might be asking a slightly different question, or they might be asking the same question, but the person they're asking is responding again with that different filter, different lens. And so they're giving what appears to be an inconsistent response, but it's not really, because they're responding from their perspective. And that's why I think it's really important that you make sure there's that consistency.
Let's take a look at the data, and I think we had a lot of we had the classes picking up, and the high the winner by many lengths is both. And I think you spoke to it earlier, Marty. It's being able to define the incident and the crisis, and when you initiate the incident, but when you initiate a communication plan. And one little thing, just a quick comment, is you talked about having canned stuff, single person, how stuff would go out. One of my favorite stories, we had an email outage, and it had been down for a little while, not critical. This is in a time when email didn't actually drive businesses, but it was clear that it was going to be down for an extended period. I went to the communications team. They drafted a response. And then I said, we had the plan for getting to customers, posting notices on the website, even radio announcements. And I said, how do we get this information to our employees and medical staff? And the HR director looked at me and said, well, we're going to send it out via email. And I said, that's the crisis we're in. We don't have email. So you need to understand that all your means of communication may not even be available to you. And that has to be built into your incident response plan. So that led to cell phone call trees and what I'll call civilian email outside of the hospital, and even text distribution lists for those caregivers who were carrying text pagers and that kind of thing. So you cannot think far enough out of the box when you're planning for an incident.
Well, and one other thing I'll add to that, David, is thinking about sequencing your communication. So, for example, I was involved in an incident where we had a breach of the records of 4.5 million individuals. And when we got ready to do our public announcement, we sent the email out to our employees late in the day before. We contacted the state regulators because we had determined, even though it wasn't something we were obligated to notify them of, we knew that as soon as it went out to the media, they were going to be calling us. So we contacted them in advance and said, hey, you're going to be hearing about this tomorrow. Here's what's going on. And then the next day, we actually did our media release. And I'm going back, I'm harping on this a bit, but that consistency message. You know, the email we sent to our employees, we knew there was a high likelihood that would get to the media that afternoon before we did our public release the next day. So you need to make sure you're thinking about the idea that the way you're communicating to employees doesn't mean it's going to stay within your organization. And that's why I said make sure it's a consistent message.
Good point.
Are we ready for our next poll question, David?
Absolutely. Time is going faster than our mouths.
How many breach notification laws do you have to consider? And again, if you'll go to poll 4 and put your response into this, you'll see we have a few options for you there to think about. So I'm interested in what people respond with. When you think about the different laws and regulations to consider, you know, if you're a large organization, you may have patients from multiple states. You may have patients from, you know, outside of the country. It's really going to depend on what your patient population is. And that's what the vast majority of you are saying. It's really dependent on your patient population, which is accurate. But when you think about this, in the United States, every state has some form of a breach notification law. Plus, I meant to look at this last night, either 2 or 3 territories. If you're a healthcare covered entity, obviously you have HIPAA to think about. And you may even have multiple state laws to consider. And the other thing to keep in mind is you may have to consider the non-patient sensitive data that might have been exposed. I worked with one client that had a phishing incident where one of their staff was pulled in by the phish. The individual then got their credentials. They then sent an email out to everybody on that person's contact list. And I think it was about 25 or 30 people on the contact list got snagged in the phish. And so all of those emails were compromised. And when they did their evaluation, it was at an academic medical center university system. And they had to notify over 400,000 people, some of whom were students, some of whom were patients, some of whom were employees, because those emails had attachments in them that had the data of all those types of individuals. So again, it's not just thinking about HIPAA and patient information that you want to make sure you're prepared for. It's thinking about what are our obligations for other types of sensitive data. I worked for the UCLA health system, and there in California, we had 3 state laws to consider and think through and analyze, plus HIPAA. Plus, in that entity was where I had the compromise of 4.5 million people. And when we did the analysis, we identified that we had patients who were residents of every state in the US. And so I think it was 12 or 14 territories. And I think it was 8 or 10 foreign countries. So we had patients from a very, very vast spread. Now, at that time, not every state had a breach notification law, but we still had to analyze it. And you have to understand what your obligations are. Are you obligated under that law? Some of the laws exempt HIPAA covered entities. Some of the laws exempt it if you have a policy that talks about how you're going to respond to it. But you really need to be prepared to think through, is this breach notification law for state X triggered? And then understand what your timeframes are, because they range from generally 30 days, 45 days, up to 60 days, up to without unreasonable delay, whatever that means. So you really need to think through what your time frame is. There's one state law that says you might have to notify the State Department of Insurance within 5 days of the incident. A number of states have regulations that say you have to notify credit reporting agencies if certain criteria about the data that was compromised is met. And it generally for that is triggered when there's 1,000 or more individuals involved. But again, it is complex, and you want to make sure you've thought through that and maybe done some analytics of your patient population. Is probably the predominant one is patient population for most of you, because your employees are, well, actually it used to be your employees were likely to live in the state that your entity was in, but with all the remote work that's occurring and people moving away from the general vicinity of the facility, you may have more employees who actually are residents of other states now that you have to think about. So it's really just making sure you're prepared for all of that and understand it, and you know, think through. And this is where David commented earlier, having those contracts in place. And I think it's one of those instances is that you're probably going to need the help of outside attorneys, and you know, they can help you analyze this and put it together and consider it. But again, you always need to think through what's our time frame, because it very well could be shorter. If you have a data compromise in California, then you're an entity that is licensed under the California Department of Health, you have 15 business days to respond. And that's a very short time frame if you've got a significant data compromise.
And you've mentioned how complex it is, and I think we all understand that, but it's not getting less complex, Marty. It's getting more complex. And I know time is winding down, but I want to mention some of these state laws like CCPA. I know Virginia has laws, and while in many cases a HIPAA covered entity is exempt, what a lot of hospitals have is a radiology group or an ED physician practice or a reference lab or even a DME provider, which may not be a HIPAA covered entity. They may even be a for-profit group operating within the entity. And how does that complicate things? Because now you have supply chain issues and customer issues with those providers operating kind of within your walls.
Well, I think you want to make sure you're looking at the laws that are applicable to you, and there's a distinction between those state privacy laws and the state breach notification laws. So right now, I think there are 5 or 6 states who have state privacy laws. CCPA was first. We now, in the last year or so, have the Virginia law and the Colorado law. And there are a couple of other states that I'm not recalling off the top of my head. Those are more tied to how you protect the data than to the requirement to notify if the data is compromised. But again, those may be laws you need to consider as well. And to your point, consider whether they're applicable to you. CCPA is not applicable to nonprofits. CCPA does have an exemption for HIPAA covered entities. And I believe that the Colorado law does as well, although I can't recall that off the top of my head now. But yeah, you need to think through, do these apply to us at all, and in what context? If you're a for-profit health system, then the CCPA might apply to you, but not apply to your patient data, but it could apply to your employee data. So again, this is the scope of analysis that you're going to have to be prepared for. And anything you've done to look at that in advance is going to make you better prepared when the incident actually does occur.
Very good. Now we're getting to the questions where you can get extra points, extra credit if you answer them right. So we can go to the next poll. And again, you know the drill, the polls button on the left-hand side of your screen. You can click that. You'll see poll number 5, and we'll let you have a couple minutes to vote. Oh, it doesn't look like a lot of extra credit. And I'm seeing one really scary answer.
Concerning.
That's a better way to say it, I guess. So it looks like most of you have voted, and the number one response is I don't know, which is not really a good answer for an incident response question. I am amazed that 27% of you have said in the last 3 months. That would be very good. It does not actually connect to our annual report data, where we did not see these exercises being performed regularly. We were probably more in the year, within the past year area, but very few people were doing it any more regularly than 3 to 6 months. Although we're going to finesse this answer with the next poll. But do you have any comments on this, Marty?
Well, as we were talking this through, David, and thinking about the responses to the poll, people who've done it within the last 3 months, I, in hindsight, wish we would have added another question. But if you've done it within the last 3 months, is that something that you're doing because you hadn't done it at all during the whole COVID crisis, and now you were trying to catch up and get yourself back on track? Or is that because you really do exercise it every 3 to 6 months? And if it's the latter answer, that's phenomenal. But if it's the former, then you really might want to consider doing it a little more frequently. And I know this had to have been incredibly difficult being in-house during the whole COVID crisis, and that wasn't the top priority for you. But when you think about it, and everything that impacted you with COVID, that might have been a good time to actually still have an exercise because of everything you were dealing with.
Yeah, you never want to enter a crisis from behind. You want to be equal with it and try to stay ahead of it. You don't play catch up in a crisis. So let's go on to the next poll question 6. And this is for all the money. Was your last exercise of the plan an enterprise exercise or mainly the IT team? I call them the first responders, IT and security, and maybe if you're really ahead of the curve, you loop in risk management and communications or privacy. So click on your polls tab, and question 6 is up for response.
So David, it doesn't look like, unless I'm missing this, our responses are correct based on what we had originally put in there.
You're right.
So what I'm going to ask people to do is bear with us with this little glitch. And if it was an enterprise exercise that you did, then click on the same button you clicked on for when you last did it. No, that's not going to work either. I apologize. So when you go to this, click within the last 3 months if it was an enterprise plan, and within the last 6 months if it was just the IT team. Our responses were supposed to be whether it was enterprise or IT, and we apologize, that little glitch happened.
I hate technology.
So again, if it was the enterprise exercise, click the within the last 3 months option. If it was the IT, mainly the IT team, click within the last 6 months option. Yeah,
and some people voted early, but I'm sorry to say I don't know is still the number one answer, and even though it may be applicable in your case.
Well, and I didn't think about that. You could, if you don't know whether it was enterprise or IT, that's fine to select that one.
Yep. But I think we can move on even with the glitch, and we'll assume that most people voted within the past 3 months was enterprise, and that's really still an astounding number. And past 6 months was probably mostly those first responders or IT and security. And I don't knows probably the I don't knows. And I know this is kind of your reason to be, Marty. Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between enterprise and mainly the IT team? And let me say, however often you're doing the enterprise, you probably need to be doing that twice as frequently for the IT and security team, because more things are changing from their perspective on a daily basis. Enterprise versus the other, Marty.
Well, again, I agree with you. I think you need to do both, because that IT team needs to be very finely honed on, getting that response and monitoring the systems and shutting them down and transitioning things. But you also need to make sure that your senior leadership and your clinical stakeholders really know how to respond to this type of an incident. And I'll share a story. I was speaking with one client, and they were talking about their incident response exercise. And they said, we're so glad we made it at enterprise level, because as we talked about shutting down the EHR and going to downtime procedures, one of the things that came out is that the vast majority of drug dosing today is in milligrams per kilogram or some other metric measure. But the pounds they had, or the weight they had on the patient, was in pounds. And very few people knew how to convert pounds to kilograms so that they could then figure out the right dose for the patient, because they had gotten so accustomed to the EHR automatically doing that for them. And having been a former respiratory therapist in a newborn and intensive care unit, it made me think about that and think, my gosh, 1 decimal point difference could kill a patient. And so you're really having critical patient care issues coming up. And then it's also thinking through getting people documenting for downtime, because that's where I see a significant number of loss in a significant cyber incident, is the lost revenue because of documentation not actually supporting the full service that was provided. And of course, everybody's in the middle of the crisis, but people have gotten so accustomed to the electronic health record supporting their documentation habits that it can be difficult to transition back to paper and capture all the information you need to be able to fully bill for the service. So you don't want to, you're going to lose revenue in a cyber incident where you have to shut down your EHR, maybe cancel visits, cancel procedures, but you want to make that as little as possible. And then it's also making sure that your senior leaders know their role in this and how they may need to respond and how they need to support the system and what they need to do. Again, a colleague talked once about the fact that he was involved in a cyber incident where they had to shut off their HR system and their payroll system. So they literally weren't able to pay people, and the CEO was standing there with a checkbook writing checks for people. Because that, you think about your workforce, how much of your workforce is likely paycheck to paycheck. And if they don't get their paycheck or it's a week late, that may have a substantial impact on their ability to pay their rent, their ability to buy their groceries, etc. So that's why we advocate, and you'll never hear me stop advocating for making sure you do routine enterprise level exercises, because it's thinking through and getting that perspective. And then the other quick story I'll share, we did an exercise with a client, and it was very difficult to convince them to include other people outside of compliance and IT. And we finally convinced them to include a few others. We still didn't get their senior leadership involved, but they did include a few others. One of those was a patient relations person. And when they talked about, well, we'd shut down the EHR, the IT team only started thinking about downtime and documentation. The patient representative said, well, what does that do to the patient portal? And said, well, we guess it would shut it down. And I said, well, that's simple. If patients try to go to the portal and they can't get in, they're going to call your help desk, which is probably already overwhelmed because of the incident. And if you can just have a banner prepared that you can put up in the portal that says temporarily unavailable, we'll let you know, or it'll come, we'll keep you updated here. That probably is going to reduce the number of people who are going to call your help desk. There are still going to be people who will call, but that again helps support. And it seems such a simple fix, But that was not something that the IT folks who don't normally think about it from the patient perspective had really thought about, or even the compliance individual had thought about. So that's what I meant earlier when I commented you get a different lens coming to the table, and they think of it with different perspectives, and that's going to get you the broadest scope possible of what could happen and how would we prepare for it.
And I'll just add one thing, Marty, before we move on to the wrap up for this portion of today's session, because I know Dan Bowden's out there and he'll beat me up if I don't mention this. But one of the things we saw during COVID-19 is even through the organizations that may not have been doing exercises or those kinds of things, we have learned across all sectors, but in healthcare no less than the others, is that the supply chain is now a critical part of your operation. We saw it early on in COVID-19 with just getting PPE for healthcare providers. And now we still see the supply chain broken across many sectors, whether it's getting chips for electronics manufacturing, or whether it's getting vegetables to feed people. And so supply chain, while it is in the NIST CSF, it doesn't feature heavily in the respond and recover sections, and we're going to see that change over time. Supply chain is critical. It changed during COVID-19. It was already the #2 threat vector, and it may have moved up from #2 in many industries, including healthcare. So one of the things that we do suggest is people build supply chain and exercises. Again, it has to be risk-based, determine who your critical vendors are, the ones you can't do without, the ones who may need access to systems, the ones, they may be shut down. What do you do when a critical supplier is in the middle of a crisis? So supply chain is going to surface in a big way in terms of response and recover, I think, for all of us, but in healthcare it can really be critical.
Yeah,
and we can move.
Sorry, I was just going to comment. I think the nuance breach kind of brought that home for a lot of healthcare entities. I had one individual tell me, we've exercised for a cyber incident in our facility, but we hadn't previously exercised for a cyber incident for one of our mission critical vendors. Yeah,
and of course SolarWinds and Microsoft and Kaseya all just piled on. It's really getting to be critical, particularly when your security vendors are having outages or breaches. We can go to the next slide, and I'll try to wrap up quickly. And this really is in a nutshell is one of the things we've learned, because what we're trying to build is not security. You will never be able to protect yourself from everything and everyone that's out there and can happen to you. What you do want to get to is a point of resilience. And while many organizations have been testing and validating technical security controls for some time, the security control is only part of it. It's a technical control. Yes, it has to be working, but you have to look at the people, the processes, and the technology, because your controls may be firing exactly correctly, just as you intended, but if they're sending it to a security manager or a business unit manager who's no longer at your organization, it's the same as not having it. So care delivery changed over the last 18 months. IT delivery has changed over the last 18 months. People, staffing, processes, and procedures have changed. So you need to go back and check those controls and validate that everything is working in terms not only of operations, but the security, the privacy, and remember that those things never end. The security and privacy and compliance journey are not destinations. They go on, and it's the gift that keeps on giving. So as we responded to our customers' needs, this is an offering we've put together, and we find it is very popular, and always find something that someone forgot. And at that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Carrie.
Well, great. Well, that was a really great session. Thanks to you both, David and Marty. Now we'll move into the collaborative breakout session, where we've come up with topics that we thought would drive some interesting conversation. Or we encourage you to ask questions that Marty and David can answer, or even open to posing another topic. So to participate in the conversation, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. And if you're not participating in the conversation actively, you can mute and leave your camera off, just because we're only allowed 16 cameras showing at one time. So on the screen, we've got some topics and questions, and I'm going to turn it back to Marty and David to start the collaborative session.
So David and I have talked and shared a couple of instances where we've encountered things with incident response exercises. And we'd love to have your feedback and input on things that came out of exercises that you've done that you think might be of benefit to other organizations.
Well, I can start with that first one, Marty, and it seems so simple. It's almost ridiculous, but it's true, and it happened. And it gets back to the point you made about having third-party organizations at least run your IR exercise. But we did one I did one with a customer, and they had no assigned scribe. So there were great learnings coming out of it, but almost nothing was being written down unless that business unit owner captured it themselves. So I would highly recommend you have an assigned scribe to capture all the little nuggets that will pop up and out of an IR exercise. It certainly is considered best practice, but a lot of people still don't think about having someone doing nothing but capturing the near misses, the misses, and the aha moments on how to fix those things.
Other people, things that you've done that you've recognized, somebody want to chime in? And if someone, first person that chimes in, or first couple of people that chimes in, we can send you a virtual coffee from Starbucks. So, you know, I know there are people out there who have done these and they've had that aha moment of, wow, we didn't think about that. We're so glad that that came out of this exercise. So we'd love to hear from you. And if you don't want to turn your webcam on and you just want to come on your microphone, that's okay. We'd love the camera just because it allows us to know that you're there and not have 5 people talk at once. But we'll coordinate that if we need to.
Hey there.
Hi,
Hey,
Dan,
Daniel.
thank you.
How's it going? No need to send me coffee, but I just wanted to say that one of the things that came up in my experience that was very useful is we had an exercise where we brought in public relations and also the legal department. And one of the big things I've seen over the years is people who, you know, when you're putting that live example, you know, what the media calls you, what do you say? Right, to talk through that with people and to get everybody under understanding that you just don't want other folks making statements. The media is going to be coming at you from any direction they can, trying to get a statement from anybody, and they don't care if they have the janitor on the phone. They're going to put your name, your company's name there, and they're going to say, "Employees said this." You know, it's a nightmare here. So one of the big things we unpacked was just a communication breakdown. Actually, I had a large consumer packaged goods company I used to work for where we did an IR exercise only on communication. The entire exercise was who do you tell what, and the real takeaway is you don't tell anybody anything really. You just always make sure you work through that centralized PR function. But even as recently as 2 weeks ago, I had a call with a business partner breach scenario, talking through some of the things they were dealing with, and that's one of the things I said. We had people making statements to the media, and that was just not. It made it a lot worse for them. It made it a lot more difficult for them to deal with. So that was a key learning on our side.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And you actually triggered something in my mind when you said that, and that's that, you know, not only having that plan, but you know, not letting your media relations people be solely responsible for the statement. I am an attorney by training, and as a compliance officer, I was often coordinating with them, and we were going back and forth. And can you say this? Well, I think legally you're not being accurate for what's happening, and I have concerns that that's going to go out into the public if you say it that way. And we had really good media relations people, and they could definitely phrase things in a way that was going to be, I'll call it media friendly, but we also wanted to make sure it was accurate from a regulatory compliance perspective. And so that was something your comment triggered for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. We had somebody else who I thought popped up for a second on a camera, but anybody else want to comment on that? Hey, David. David Weiner.
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 It's good to see you again, Marty. So, yeah, I guess the new guy will chime in. But something else I wanted to add that, in my experience, was really useful is that a lot of organizations like to do their incident response exercises or their downtime stuff at night, which is great for the nighttime people because it's slow and generally they just hang out until it's over with and then they go back and they do stuff. But I almost insisted at my organization that we did them at least annually during the day. And it does cause disruption and it is a bit of a pain, but you're never going to know when you're going to have a downtime. And the only way that those people are going to be prepared is if they understand and they know how to go through the procedures. So I got a lot of positive feedback from the caregivers that went through that because they had no idea what was involved. So.
Yeah, good advice. We don't get to pick when the bad thing happens.
Right.
And so you need to be ready whenever it happens.
Well, and quite honestly, David, I think the reverse can be true as well. If you only exercise it in the daytime, then you might have the fact that you haven't prepared those nighttime people when there are often fewer staff members. And so people may be asked to do a little bit more because there are fewer people around. So I think, doing it at both times is very important. That's a great point, David Weiner. Anybody else want to chime in on this topic? Don't be shy. You're among friends.
We're not going to tell anyone, no matter what you tell us. Well, I'll bet if we were giving away wine, we'd have better responses than coffee.
Oh, I'd respond more. So,
well, go ahead, Marty.
I was just going to say, we'll start with our next question, but if you think of something to answer in any of these questions, just because we've moved on doesn't mean you can't chime in on that as well. And particularly this first one where your experience is going to help your colleagues that are on the call and really help all of us, because I if you've heard me say it once now, you've heard me probably say it 5 times in this presentation. Our collective perspectives on this are always going to help us improve and be better prepared to respond to an incident. So, again, feel free to chime in, even if you think of it as we move on to the next topic. So what are your organization's potential roadblocks when trying to prepare for a cyber incident? Okay, we've got 61 of you on the call, and I can't believe that nobody has a roadblock.
I'll jump in, Marty. This is Chris Couchet from Albany Medical Center. I think the largest challenge for doing IR exercises and all the other things that we have to do is really engaging with the business in the organization. The technical pieces are technical pieces, and And otherwise, it really comes down to how do you engage the business partners? How do you, and I know it was mentioned a little bit before by David Weiner around, building out those exercises. But I think that's kind of our biggest challenge. I won't call it a roadblock, but it certainly is the biggest challenge that we have is how do you engage the partners within the organization to really make the preparation a much more complete level of preparation. That's why I say it's not really a roadblock, but it's a challenge, because we can prep all we want from a technical perspective, but without our business partners' perspectives, views of what the things that we do technically really mean to them and how they impact the real business and the workflows and those things, it's just a one-sided technical activity and preparation versus really having a holistic view on it.
Chris, I'm going to chime in there because I know you have great support up there, but in my experience, getting the business involved comes down to the CEO, the COO, the most senior executive leadership, and how, we all have ways of figuring out how to do that, but how do you get the CEO to tell everyone you're going to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And I think, and you're right, we have a lot of support from our executives. I think in our case, we had good support, for several years. And then for us, WannaCry was that bellwether moment. And although it didn't hit us, we were, knock on wood, we were still protected. We didn't fall victim to it. Everyone around us did. And to the point where hospitals were, shutting down whole units, other hospitals were, diverting patients in all, not only from an ER perspective, but even from routine cath lab cases, mammo cases, whatever it may be. We had a lot of that going on in our area, and that was a bellwether moment. And at that point, things kind of flipped for us. And where we went from good support, we went into like, oh my God, Chris, what are you going to do to protect the organization, and what can we do for you, right? So it took a bellwether moment. It took one of those incidents to really make a big difference. And then we have had really good support. And then the next incident happens, right? And again, the next reading in or the next newspaper article, or the person down the street gets breached. And for example, one of the largest colleges, one of the oldest colleges in the country, who's right down the road from us, had to cancel finals because they had a breach. It's the first time in their history that they've ever, in 150, 160 year history, that they've ever had to cancel finals. And that was a huge aha moment for the region. And again, renewed emphasis on, oh my God, Chris, how are you gonna protect us? How are you gonna do those things? So I think those are some of the things that you certainly need. And then to have a presence in front of your board, to have a presence in front of your executives, to constantly remind them of all of the things that they don't see on a regular basis. So we report out monthly, for example, on all our attack statistics. How much are we attacked every single day, every single week, every single month? That's always in front of our, it's always in front of our leadership, always in front of our board. So that's how we do it. We've been given permission to do it that way.
I just have one quick response. When you said they asked Chris, how are you going to protect us? My immediate thought was, he's not, because you leadership are responsible for this, to give me the support I need to make sure you've protected us the way you need to. Don, you've been waiting patiently. Do you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, and you've been doing security for more than a couple minutes now, Dan.
Don, I think you're on mute, baby. We can't hear you.
Yeah,
Still
you
not
are
hearing
muted.
you. It's showing you unmuted on the platform, but we're
Wow.
not hearing you. If you're like me, I always have to remember to select the right device, whether it's my headset or my web camera, microphone, or something else.
This is another reason I hate technology.
Well, Don, if we figure that out, we'd love to hear your thoughts or comments. Anybody else want to chime in? What are your roadblocks? What are the challenges you see? Wow, I can't believe we have this many people who don't have any roadblocks to incident response. That's great.
They chose the I don't know, I guess. Maybe we should drop down to cyber insurance. That always generates a flurry of discussion. So I'll just ask
Okay, go
very
ahead.
broadly, does anyone have any cyber insurance insights, concerns, issues, stories? I will start out by telling mine. I became CIO after an incident. I was the privacy and security officer. We had, I will date myself by mentioning the attack. It was Bugbear. And we were down for a week, and I was moved over to IT from audit and compliance. And we were down for about 5 days. Fortunately, I had deployed as the security officer a series of lockdown workstations on all the nursing floors. So everything in the data center was up and running, but no desktops were working, no laptops were working across the organization, which made life very difficult. But we had a very limited number of these lockdown workstations on the care floors, and we struggled through. And about a week after that, we went through the cleanup. We had to re-image some 8,000 machines by hand, people going machine to machine. And after about a week of the cleanup, and we were all up and running and restored, I called our head of risk management to check on the insurance policy, and because I knew we had one when I took the job. And this is about the 11th of the month by now. And there was this long pause when I asked him about the policy and the process for filing a claim and all that. And he said, well, I canceled the policy as of the 1st of this month, so we don't have any cyber insurance. And I'm sure I said it in less than polite terms, like, why did you cancel the cyber insurance policy without talking to anyone in IT or security? And I didn't get a good answer, but that was my first round with cyber insurance, and it was not a happy one. So, anyone else have a cyber insurance story?
Oh, heck, I'll jump in again, David. That's fine. You know I'm pretty talkative if I get. You know, I think that the two things I'll say on cyber insurance. So one item is whether you have an IR vendor on retainer or not really makes a difference in terms of how they respond. So we've had, we're a multi-hospital system. We've taken over. We're the academic. I'm over in the academic medical center side, and then we have several smaller community hospitals that are all in different states of security levels and maturity. And as we took over one of our smaller hospitals, they had a cyber incident. And we had, I'll just say it, we had our incident response provider on retainer. We had them on retainer for a number of years. Same insurance company that we used, we also used, the smaller hospital also used. While we had the IR vendor on retainer outside of the insurance company, the smaller hospital did not, even though that IR provider was the provider of choice for the same insurance company. So what we see is that if you don't have an incident response provider on retainer, what happens is you call your insurance company, activate your cyber policy, and it then took 2 weeks to get that incident response provider to nail down a contract, even though they're under contract with the insurance company. It took 2 weeks to get all of our components agreed to with the insurance provider and the IR provider to get them finally engaged on the ground. Now, we've activated in the past, and the difference is it took 2 hours to get our incident response provider activated on our incident. So 2 hours versus 2 weeks, you may want to consider having that independent incident response retainer paid for up front outside of the insurance company. Just a thing to think about. And then what we've seen generally in terms of cyber insurance, again, we've been doing it for a while. We've had cyber insurance for a while. When 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we used to see that we were well ahead of the game with the cyber insurance players. So they would go, "Oh my God, you're already doing this, you're already doing this, you're already doing that," and we got good constant feedback. They've gone from down here to up here now in terms of their expectations. And if you haven't seen it, that's what you'll see. If you haven't seen it lately, that's what you'll see. Even the move from last year to the annual renewals, that gap was like that. Because they're getting a lot more savvy. They're asking very, very specific questions in terms of the cyber, your cyber coverage, and down to the granular detail of what protections you're putting, not just generically, do you have a anti-malware provider? They're like, do you have an anti-malware provider, and do you stop end-use devices from installing in the CTEK directory? That's how specific some of these insurance providers are getting now. They're getting extremely detailed in the questions that they're asking you on the cyber coverage. So
Yeah, it's starting to look like a risk assessment when they come in to underwrite you, and the payouts have been huge, and so their job is to not pay for anything, and so they are tightening down. And here's a fascinating statistic that should scare all of us, but it helps you understand why the underwriters are starting to do this. Because they used to just underwrite everything. You get a 10-question questionnaire, and that was it. And they'd underwrite you, no details. But between 2016 and 2020, the end of 2020, the beginning of 2016 to the end of 2020, there were over 4,000 ransomware attacks daily in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean they're all successful, but you think about 4,000 attacks per day over the last 4 years, and I can tell you ransomware attacks in 2021 are higher. So the potential of getting cyber insurance is going to get more and more difficult. There will be more hurdles to jump unless you've been through this process and have all those things in place before they say, we're going to look at what you're doing before we underwrite you.
Yeah, and Linda put a couple of good comments in the chat. One is that they're having a hard time being able to see the policy, and that is so important. And that's also an important engagement with your senior leadership, because I've seen it where senior leadership says, well, CIO, you go get the policy for us. And they don't really pay attention to what the requirements are and what their obligations are and what the terms are. And so you need to be, helping ensure that everybody's looking at this and really thinking about it and why that's going to be a benefit to you. Like any insurance policy, they're going to have coverage criteria, and they may require that you have certain things in place. And I think, Chris, your point was very well taken. I think you're going to see that tighten down even further. And so, if you don't have all that stuff in place, you may have no coverage. So, you're at risk for them denying coverage if you don't have all the things in place that the policy requires. And then, Linda, you commented also that it took a while for you to engage the vendors. So I have two comments around that. One is, you do want to be thinking about that kind of stuff in advance, but you also need to be very cognizant of whether or not your cyber insurance company has a panel that you're required to use. It's not uncommon that they have a forensic, a panel of forensic firms, or a panel of breach response firms, or a panel of law firms. And so one of the things you want to be aware of is, or two things actually. One is that part of the agreement that you have to use somebody on their panel? And so you may have somebody that you've engaged with previously that you like and want to work with, but they may not be on the insurance company's panel. And so you need to be cognizant, because if you go out and retain that same entity as part of your response, the insurance may not cover it because it's not on the panel. And then the second comment is, I think you want to think about that in negotiating the cyber insurance contract. Have something in place that says, there may be a way for you to engage somebody who's not on their panel. And there's criteria around when that would be triggered, but maybe thinking through what that might mean for you. And it might also mean that you want to take a look at who they put on the panel. I've had one instance where I won't name the vendor, but the vendor that was on the cyber insurance company's panel that the organization used didn't provide them with the highest quality service, in my opinion. And so they were kind of stuck with them for that incident. They unfortunately had a second incident, and they went with one of the other vendors on the panel. But you can't always have a guarantee that just because they picked them, they're good. And, as part of your agreement, you also may want to put in place that if you're obligated to use somebody on that panel, that they have an agreement with those companies that they will expedite the contracting process if you do have to have a separate contract with them.
Yeah, and I'd like your comment on this, Marty, from kind of a legal and as well as risk perspective. But many years ago now, I was with another security firm, and we had a customer who was breached, and they had done a good job. They were pretty mature. They had a lot of things in place. And because it was a breach, they had to declare the breach and send the notifications. But again, they had contained it. They had handled it very well, and they were getting ready to submit their claim. And it was denied, which stunned me. But there was a clause in their contract that says you have to be compliant with all applicable state and federal laws. Well, what happened when they filed the breach? The OCR came in, and it certainly is their job to find out what you weren't doing under HIPAA privacy or security. And of course they found some things, and the insurance underwriter turned around and said, well, you weren't current and compliant with all applicable state and federal laws. What kind of situation does that create? Is there a way around that?
Well, I think that's to the point I was just making. Understanding what the criteria of coverage are, so that you can look at that and say, are we at risk here for non-coverage? Some cyber policies have a triggering time frame. In other words, you have to let us know within X time frame, or we could deny coverage. And you think about it, there's a high risk that you might be found non-compliant with laws and regulations if you have a significant data compromise. You might be able to argue that. We all know that we can take reasonable and appropriate steps. and still not account for everything that might occur. But you're going to have to be prepared to demonstrate that. And, you know, I'm a compliance individual at heart, and nobody's going to be surprised to hear me say, document, document, document. But Linda, I think you made another great point. Now, Linda has indicated she can't figure out, I mean, for some reason, there's an issue with her being able to come on camera and speak. So she's put some great comments in the chat. And she commented, cyber insurance vendors can also find your organization's scorecard and then ask you what you're doing with all those risks. And that's tied to your point, David. You know, if you've got a scorecard out there that seems to demonstrate that you're not compliant with the applicable laws and regulations, then that may be a basis for them not to give you coverage in the first place, or then to deny coverage if an event occurs. So that's thinking through it. And I do have to make sure I say, although I'm an attorney, I'm not providing legal advice. Nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice. This is all purely for informational and educational purposes.
Thank you. Duly noted. And that leads me to this question, Marty, because earlier this year, there was an amendment to the HITECH Act, which compels the Secretary of HHS and the Inspector General for HHS to consider NIST a security best practice. And it should be considered when they're looking at fines and penalties and even audit from the CMS side. Is that something that can be used if you're doing a NIST assessment and can indicate you're conforming with NIST and meeting those requirements? Does that help you with an insurance company after the fact?
Yeah, I think it can. I think it's going to depend on how that fully evolves and what we see there. But I definitely think it can. I've served as an expert witness in a number of cases. And, you know, that's in one case in particular, the plaintiffs had an expert who said the organization wasn't using NIST and therefore they're not compliant with HIPAA. And, you know, my response to that was, there's nothing in HIPAA that mandates they use NIST. Is NIST a good framework? You know, yes, obviously we use it as the basis for our risk assessments for organizations. And I think it is a good process to use. But with that sort of endorsement, if you will, by HHS, I think that's going to have a higher level of influence on the regulators. And I think then by default, it's going to have a higher level of influence on cyber insurance companies. Now, folks, if you can't already see, David and I can talk all day about this topic, but we really do want your engagement and your thoughts and your comments. Now, if you're having any difficulty with showing your camera or with your mic, please do what Linda's done and just let us know in the chat. And if you have specific questions, we'll try to address them that way. We would love to see you and hear from you, but I recognize that a few people may be having some issues with the platform and its connectivity to their particular system and settings. And so with that, Chris said, I find that my organization is willing to put resources to tech more easily than to compliance and privacy. Great point about cyber insurance denials of claims for even the smallest issues in compliance. And Chris, David's going to laugh at this because you're speaking my voice. You're playing my music, because that is something that I routinely see with all the cyber incidents. Companies are saying, throw the money at cyber, throw the money at cyber. And I don't see a stronger recognition between the symbiotic relationship between privacy and security. And so they may not be willing to put that same money towards compliance and privacy. And so helping convince them, anything you've got that can support that, you know, I'd love to talk with you further about that, because, you know, that's where we see the challenge when we talk to clients. And I hear from compliance officers and privacy officers, you know, they're willing to throw all this money to cybersecurity, but, you know, thinking through the privacy complexities of that and some of the issues around that, I think are something that, in my experience, we have to do a better job of educating senior leadership, not only on each topic, but the interrelationship of each topic.
Yeah, and that goes back to the discussion we've had, and I've been quoted many times for saying this, but there's this myth that that technology will fix our security problems. And you've heard it more than once today already, but I will say it again. It isn't just the technology. It is more importantly the people and the process. And then, yes, the technology has to be in place. But if you're not supporting the people, and that's from the board on down, and they're not trained and engaged, and the processes don't support them and allow them to do what they need to do and tell them what they need to do when they need to do it, as I am fond of saying, a fool with a tool is still a fool. And so all the technology in the world isn't going to solve your security issue if you're not being smart about it, using the right tools, collecting the right data, and then using that data to support your people, to retrain people, to drive your processes and how you respond to what you find with those tools. So it's wonderful to throw money at tools, but you're not really solving the problem until you, as Marty said, you've got to engage privacy, you've got to engage compliance, and you've got to rebuild all those processes so all the right people are engaged from day one, not after you've had something that failed.
Yeah, and I want to tie a question that's kind of related to our question number 3, but I'd love people's thoughts and comments on, if you've been able to successfully engage your senior leaders. We heard from Chris earlier, and it sounds like he was definitely able to do that. But, in the organizations I've worked with, I've had both sides of this, where the senior leaders are like, you do compliance, you do privacy, and to the CISO or CIO, you do security, you go do what you do, and, just do it. I don't really need to know about it or be involved in it. And trying to educate them that, ultimately it's your responsibility. You've given me the oversight for compliance or privacy, or the CISO oversight for security, but ultimately the buck stops with you, and help them to understand why it's important to them and why they really need to make the call and support it and resources and talk the talk and walk the walk. And I've had the experience that Chris described, where I've had very supportive senior leadership. And so I'd be interested in hearing from the folks in the audience, kind of, do you have a success story there, and what kind of swayed your senior leaders, and, what you're able to do? Or is that something you're still struggling with?
We can't turn on your camera, but we can call on you. In a nice way, of course.
We have a response in the chat. If that's the way you want to respond, that's fine. I mean, again, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, but, we have a response from Amy that says she's struggling with this, and it doesn't surprise me. But who on the call can help Amy out? Like I said, we've already heard from Chris, but who else can help Amy out and give her some ideas on how she might be able to engage her senior leadership and really get them to pay attention to this?
All right, fine, David. I'll jump in again. I'll just say that, for us, it took a while. It's not something that happens overnight. We had to put a governance structure in place, and that included, a management. So we created a management structure so that first our managers heard and our leaders heard what happens from a cyber perspective. We made it, then escalated that, and we started creating committee level presence at our executive teams, and then finally presence at the board level. So it took a little while. It took the span of a couple of years to try to get that put in place. But once once they got the drug, they couldn't get enough of it, because at the end of the day, this is the stuff that really scares people. I mean, we know how critical cyber is to healthcare. One of the ways that we did all of that as well was we partnered with our compliance and our risk managers. So our chief corporate compliance officer and our chief risk management officer were critical in really turning this from an IT thing into an organization thing, right? The way that my corporate compliance officer will say this is that cyber has now risen to be one of the top 2 risks for our health center, for our health organization. And when a board hears that from an officer of the organization, especially the compliance officer, that holds legal weight, right? Because the board and the senior management are obligated to listen to the corporate compliance officer. I mean, that is their role. And they have an obligation to the organization to hear those messages. And that's usually a formalized process that's already in place in all our organizations. So that may be a process if you can really get in close with your corporate compliance officer, especially, that could be one of the ways that that you really get in there. So that's one of the ways that some of the things that we did to really get that in there. And then my background is biomedical engineering originally, and I had biomedical engineering here for many, many years. I still do after 30 years. I grew up in Joint Commission in the hospitals. And what I always say, and I know David's heard me say this before when he's been involved in things here, what I say to my leadership is that cybersecurity should become the DNA that Joint Commission is to a hospital. Joint Commission is a DNA strand that runs through all of our hospitals. It's not questioned, it's just done. If the Joint Commission says, hey, look, I got a new standard for X, Y, and Z, the hospital goes, oh, all right, we got a new standard for X, Y, and Z, we got to make it happen. That would be the time or the place where I would feel comfortable with cyber, is that cyber becomes one of those DNA strands so that we don't have to beg for money. It's not a great thing when we get funding because we had to fight for it and won the battle. It should just be something that the hospital accepts that, hey, this is part of doing business. It's now become part of that background that we just have to do, and people don't think about it. We're not there yet. I don't think many people are there yet, but that's where we really want to get going to.
Yeah, and before we move on to our next participant, I just want to comment, Chris, that I think you're exactly right. And I've said many, many times, we shouldn't be thinking of this as a cyber risk. We should think of this as a business risk, because it's a risk to the business and the operations of the business. So transitioning that and getting the senior leader to think about it as in business terms, as opposed to more technical terms, I think is helpful there. And I apologize, I see you on camera, your beautiful face, but we don't see your name. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself and provide your comments and insights.
Thank you. I'm Amy Cohn, the one that made the comment about the struggling with leadership. I am the compliance officer for our agency. I'm a small rural government agency. And thank you for your comments. I grabbed some good ideas. I feel that our management doesn't even see it as a risk. And so trying to gather, strategies around them being able to see this as a risk is where we're struggling. For us being a small government entity, it's about, we do child welfare and social services. And so the emergency for them is a child being abused or adult being abused or our psychiatric hospital. So they're dealing with emergency all the time, and this area, this focus is not to them the highest risk, losing life. To them, it's higher risk. So that's where I struggle a lot, is how to make it just as important as everything else we do, that business risk.
So you mentioned something that sort of triggered a comment for me, and it might sound a bit extreme, but think about it. You talked about psychiatric patients. Well, where are those psychiatric patients being seen, and how are they being seen? And what would happen if your system went down and one of your patients had a crisis and the patient ended up committing suicide? because the provider couldn't connect with them. And, I'm not saying that that would necessarily trigger something like a malpractice case, but you can certainly create scenarios and maybe help get them to thinking about it in the terms of the, quote, crisis they're used to dealing with, and how having a cyber incident or a breach could have implications and exacerbate some of those crises that they're used to dealing with. If you need to make that connection to get that child out of that abusive home and get Child Protective Services there very quickly, but you can't make the connection because your email's down or even your phone system's down, and you can't get the child out, what's the impact of that child? And that, could there be consequences to that child that you're trying to protect that's part of your business? So, those are the kinds of things I try to create is, how do I connect this and make this, as Chris said, part of the DNA of the organization, as opposed to, this is a silo of cyber, this is a silo of privacy, this is a silo of X, and then nobody really sees that what the business relationship is between all of those components.
Marty, I'll just say that I think one of the other techniques is, and maybe to the question, is one of the things that we do is we equate if we have for example, we have a new contract coming in for a system that we're going to get, and it holds PHI or PII. We try to equate that to a cost. We equate a breach to a cost, right? And it's a straight line calculation for us with no fluff in it. We take the number of patient records, or in the case of New York State, PII records. We take that number and we multiply it by, let's say you take the Ponymon average cost of a breach, whatever that normal is, an average cost per record in healthcare, and we multiply it by that. So it does a couple things. It puts a value to how much that breach is going to cost at a minimum, from just a fine perspective or a settlement perspective with OCR at a minimum, and then you tack onto that any of the other costs. But it also drives your insurance number that you're asking a vendor to provide in their insurance protections if you do have a breach. And at the end of the day, you may say, okay, I've got 500 records and it's going to cost me $175 per record. You know what? That's a risk I'm willing to take. And at least you've made a risk-based decision for your organization, or your organization has been allowed to make a risk-based decision on what a breach really means. Now, if it's an EHR that you've got millions of patients in, well, that drives that should drive the answer for your risk manager, for your compliance officer, and your executives. That is a significant financial risk. And, we put the numbers up every year, like I said before. Any breach over, the average breach, I think the cost right now is $4.7 million. I think IBM just came out with that. I'm not sure if that was attached to Ponymon or not, but I heard just this morning they came out with that number. And the number that really gets our board kind of churning is, because of our size, any breach over 1 million records, that average number then goes up to over $50 million. And that's
Chris,
yeah.
I thank you. You made some great points, but I want to give Jessica some time to add her comments. So I really appreciate your comments and thoughts. I think you gave us some very meaningful information. But Jessica, I want you to give you the opportunity to add your thoughts and comments, since you've been waiting so patiently.
Thank you, Marty. And I perform assessments for CynergisTek, for those that you don't know, or those of you that don't know me. And I have had an interesting conversation with an organization around having to buy into cybersecurity and the tools, and the way they did it. I'm sorry?
You're pausing and you're not coming through clearly. So just wanted to let you know that.
Sorry, I'll turn my video off. One of the interesting ways I've spoken with an organization, and one of the interesting ways that they do this, get the buy-in from their leadership, is they get the buy-in from the individual departments. And the security department says, we don't ask for tools, we don't ask for improvements and things of that nature. we have the department ask for it, and leadership is more willing to buy into that when all of the departments come together and ask for these tools and these processes to be implemented, not just cybersecurity in a siloed environment. And that they had buy-in from leadership because they went that route.
And I'm going to add one comment, and then I'm going to turn it back over to David for any final comments, and then back to Carrie for closing us out. I just want to tell a quick story of when I took my position as compliance officer for UCLA Health System. As any compliance officer would, I put together my annual work plan, and I went to present it with my first budget request, and I was asking for 7 additional positions. I already had 15 in the office. I had privacy, security, hospital services, physician services, and research compliance under me. And what I did on my work plan is I put together what I thought were all the risk areas that we needed to address. And I put everything in red that I wasn't going to be able to address unless I got the additional resources. And I simply turned to the leadership and said, if you don't think these are risk areas that we need to address, then don't give me the resources. But be aware and very clear, I will not be addressing these risks. In some cases, I couldn't because I didn't have the expertise on my team. And in other cases, there just weren't enough people to do it. And that's what I shared with them. I said, you know, if you make that risk decision, as Chris was talking, and you say, we're going to accept that risk, we're not going to address it as part of our compliance program and our annual auditing and monitoring and other activity, then I'll go home and sleep at night because you guys decided where the risk tolerance of the organization was. And fortunately for me, the CEO looked at this and said, oh my God, we can't not address these risks. And I got all 7 of my positions. And so that's something that I think, you know, that you need to really transition this, as Chris commented, and Jessica, your thought with one of our clients, is make them think about this as a business issue, not as a privacy issue, a cyber issue, a compliance issue. It's a business issue, and they get to decide the risk tolerance, and they have to live with it if somebody comes back later and says, were you freaking crazy? So David, thoughts, comments, anything you want to add to that or close out? Any comments?
No, I'll just add the one comment to that, and it's something I've been saying for 21 years, Marty, in a very different way than you just said it, but the exact same message. Security and privacy is now a strategic function of healthcare. They will not be able to do digital transformation. They will not be able to do consumer-driven healthcare. They will not be able to stay alive unless they make these technology changes and make access available, and that will require that privacy and security be in place. It is pure and simple a business issue. It has nothing to do with technology. And with that,
I'm sorry, David, just quickly before we move, Linda made a final comment in the chat, so I wanted to share that and make sure everybody saw it. And,
cool.
And this is something we've talked about before. She talked about the fact that they did their exercise and found out that individuals had to look for the playbooks and the IR plan and the business recovery and all of that, and then try to read it or go to the section it applied. They needed to find the contact list to contact everybody applicable. So it's important that for us to have readily available and in a location where it can be easily accessed and everyone knows where it is. So I think that's a great point, Linda.
And it can't be just online, because I've seen those events happen too. You stand up the command center, the systems are down, and no one can get to it. So make sure there's printed copies, or you have them offline somewhere on a device where you can get to them. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Carrie.
Great. Thank you both. That was really informative, and I appreciate everybody that attended and for participating. Stay tuned for your virtual Starbucks gift card. And on the screen now, I just wanted to again mention that our 2021 annual report is published, and you can find that on our website. And then don't miss our next session will be August 18th on CMMC, which is the new Department of Defense requirement for all of their suppliers to be have this certification. And I know that we've heard a lot of our clients are unaware of this requirement, and it mostly is if you are doing either you are in or near a military base, or you are doing research with the military, you more than likely are going to be required to be CMMC certified. So an important session not to miss. Again, thank you all for participating, and we will see you next time.